The gym is silent now. Just the hum of old fluorescent lights and the smell of rusted iron. The same dumbbells that once rang with fury now rest untouched, cold, forgotten. Yet within this silence echoes the story of a man who once moved the world of bodybuilding, only to be crushed beneath the weight of his own perfection. Paul DeMayo, the man they called Quadzilla. A physique carved in defiance of human limits. Legs like marble pillars, a frame that looked sculpted by divine obsession. But behind those legendary quadriceps was a young man haunted by a need to be flawless, to earn not just applause, but immortality in iron. He came from the rough neighborhoods of Massachusetts, a place that forged toughness, not fame. When he first wrapped his hands around a barbell, it wasn't about trophies, it was about control. In a world that offered little, the weight offered everything: structure, pain, and the illusion of peace. The iron never lied to him. It told the truth of discipline, of sweat, of consequence. It gave him identity. It gave him purpose. But as his body grew stronger, his mind began to fracture. Because the same iron that built gods also demands blood. Fame came too fast. Pressure mounted. The young prodigy who once trained to escape his demons soon found himself trapped within them. He wasn't just lifting weights anymore. He was lifting expectation, scrutiny, and the crushing pursuit of physical perfection that devoured men whole. And when that burden became too great, Paul DeMayo disappeared from the stage. But his legend remained, not as a tale of victory, but of warning. This is not a story of muscles. This is the story of what happens when a man gives everything, his youth, his sanity, his life, to become perfect. Before he was Quadzilla, he was just Paul, a restless kid from Massachusetts with calloused hands and something feral in his eyes. The world around him was small, narrow streets, cracked sidewalks, and the quiet hum of working-class life. It wasn't a place where legends were supposed to be born, but from a young age, Paul carried a certain defiance, that invisible fire only the great ones ever feel before anyone else sees it. He wasn't built from privilege or pedigree. He was built from pressure. Every rep, every strained breath in that dim local gym was an act of rebellion, against mediocrity, against weakness, against the quiet death of potential that swallows most men before they ever fight back. His first gym wasn't glamorous. It smelled of chalk, sweat, and machine oil, the kind of place where men trained not for selfies or validation, but because they had to. The weights were chipped, the mirrors fogged, and the heater barely worked through New England winters. But to Paul, that gym was a cathedral. Each clang of the plates was a hymn, each drop of sweat, a prayer. He grew fast, too fast. While most teens spent their nights chasing distraction, Paul chased the burn. His legs thickened, his frame broadened, and soon he became a spectacle in his neighborhood. People whispered. Coaches noticed. He didn't just lift, he attacked the weights, as if every session was a war between him and the limits of his own body. There was no plan, no coach with a clipboard, no scientific program, just raw will. He studied magazines with the intensity of a scholar studying scripture. Arnold, Zane, Columbu, ghosts of a golden era that called to him. He mimicked their routines, devoured their diets, and built his life around one unshakable belief, that through discipline and pain, he could transcend everything ordinary about his existence. By his late teens, his quadriceps were already absurd, bulging, detailed, alien. He didn't know it yet, but those legs would define his career, his nickname, and eventually, his myth. Local competitions became easy prey. The crowds cheered. Judges stared. And for the first time, the boy from Massachusetts realized the iron had given him power. But behind every set of perfect muscles lies a deeper story. The same intensity that pushed him forward also began to isolate him. Friends faded. Relationships strained. He started training alone, muttering to himself, lost in that trance only bodybuilders know, the tunnel vision where time dissolves, and only pain and perfection remain. In those moments, the gym became his world, and the world outside became irrelevant. The iron was his compass, his companion, and his confession booth. And though he couldn't articulate it yet, Paul had already stepped onto a path that would define and destroy him in equal measure. By the time he entered his early 20s, People no longer saw Paul from Massachusetts. They saw a phenomenon. His symmetry, muscle maturity, and leg development were unheard of for his age. Magazines began to take notice. Coaches wanted him. Sponsors courted him. He was no longer training in the shadows. The floodlights had found him, and with them came expectation. The boy who once lifted to escape the world was now being devoured by it. He was on the brink of national recognition, standing at the threshold of the IFBB. But beneath the spotlight, a quiet dread stirred. Because perfection isn't a destination. It's a debt, and Paul DeMayo was about to start paying in full. When Paul DeMayo stepped onto a national stage for the first time, the world of bodybuilding blinked, then stared. There were hundreds of competitors that night, but only one whose legs looked like they'd been carved from the earth itself. Every stride he took rippled with power, every pose a declaration that a new era was forming, an era of impossible proportions. They called him Quadzilla. And for a brief, blazing moment, Paul DeMayo was the future. The early 1990s bodybuilding scene was a war zone of aesthetics and brutality. Gone were the golden era lines of Zane and Reeves. This was the age of mass, density, and monstrous conditioning. The pros were demigods, and each show was a battlefield of flesh and willpower. To rise through those ranks required not just genetics, but madness. Paul had both. He trained with a violence that unnerved other athletes. While others counted reps, Paul attacked sets like a man punishing himself for existing. His workouts weren't sessions, they were exorcisms. Deep squats with blood rushing to his head, leg presses that left him unconscious on the floor, veins bursting like wires under his skin. Every session whispered the same mantra through his bones. More. Harder. Again, and his body responded. His legs became mythic, their cross striations so sharp they looked chiseled by knives. His calves, often neglected by others, hung heavy and carved. Photographers couldn't capture his physique without focusing on the quads. They dominated the frame, like living sculptures from another realm. In 1994, that relentless discipline culminated in his crowning moment, the NPC Nationals, a title that separated contenders from legends, the event that would launch him into the IFBB Professional League. That night, the crowd witnessed a storm. When DeMayo walked on stage, there was silence, the kind that comes before awe. His presence wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The symmetry, the conditioning, the impossible fullness. It was as if every sleepless night, every ounce of pain, had been transmuted into muscle. When the lights hit his physique, the audience gasped. He hit a front quad pose and it was over. The other competitors faded into the backdrop. The judges didn't even pretend it was close. Paul DeMayo won the 1994 NPC Nationals, one of the youngest ever to do so, and earned his IFBB Pro card. For a moment, the universe was his. Sponsors lined up. Magazines featured him. He became a symbol of raw American iron power, the working-class kid who rose to Olympus through sweat alone. His photos flooded gym walls across the country. Every teenager who trained legs whispered his name, but with glory comes gravity. The higher Paul climbed, the more invisible weight pressed down upon him. The bodybuilding industry is a machine that devours its own. It demands more mass, more definition, more drugs, more pain. The same passion that had once freed him began to enslave him. And Paul, for all his discipline, wasn't built for politics, deceit, or business smiles. He was built to lift, to suffer, to win. Behind the cameras, cracks began to show. He struggled with injuries, knees that throbbed, tendons that screamed from the years of squatting monstrous loads. His mental health wavered. The same intensity that made him great also isolated him. He began to retreat from people, even those closest to him. He once told a friend, "You don't understand. I can't stop. If I stop, I disappear." He competed in the 1995 Mr. Olympia, the dream stage, the summit of the sport. But standing beside titans like Dorian Yates and Nasser El-Sonbadi, Paul looked smaller, depleted, human. The pressure to hold his peak destroyed his rhythm. He placed poorly, and for the first time, doubt began to creep in. In the eyes of the industry, one failure was enough to erase everything. Sponsors cooled. Calls stopped. The lights dimmed, but for Paul, it wasn't about the title. It was about the idea. He had tasted godhood and now was falling back into mortality. The iron, once his salvation, began to feel heavier than ever before. He tried to push harder, train longer, regain the magic. But perfection once lost rarely returns. His body began to resist. His mind, the same mind that once moved mountains, turned against him. And when the applause finally faded, Paul DeMayo found himself alone in the same kind of gym where it had all begun. The same smell. The same steel. Only now the silence was different, because he wasn't chasing greatness anymore. He was chasing ghosts. By the mid-1990s, the golden glow of Paul DeMayo's rise had dimmed into something darker, a shadowed reflection of everything he had once been. The stage lights that once crowned him now burned his eyes. The clatter of weights that once sounded like victory began to echo like guilt. He was still young, mid-20s, yet he'd already lived through the highest peaks and lowest valleys a bodybuilder could know. His physique had reached near mythical status, yet his spirit was quietly breaking. Because what no one tells you about chasing perfection is this: the body doesn't break first. The mind does. To build a body like Paul's required complete submission. Every meal, every rep, every breath, dictated by the pursuit. He couldn't go out without eyes following him, whispers trailing behind. That's Quadzilla. People treated him like a living statue, something both admired and alien, but statues don't bleed. And Paul was bleeding inside. He began to feel trapped in his own creation, a prisoner inside the flesh he had sculpted. Every flaw became an accusation, every lost ounce of muscle a failure. He couldn't eat without measuring guilt, couldn't rest without fearing regression. The iron that had once been his companion now mocked him from the corner of every room. It wasn't vanity that destroyed him. It was the discipline itself. The same sacred discipline that had built his empire turned to tyranny when it could no longer serve him. After the 1995 Olympia disappointment, DeMayo disappeared from the spotlight. The world of bodybuilding moved on swiftly, as it always does. New stars emerged. Magazines replaced his face. Sponsors withdrew their promises. He returned to Massachusetts, not as a champion returning home, but as a man retreating to familiar ruins. The same neighborhoods, the same cold winters, the same gym walls that had once witnessed his rise now watched his slow unraveling. Without the stage, his purpose fractured. The silence of normal life hit him harder than any leg press. He began working regular jobs, construction, security, anything to pay bills. But the iron still called to him at night, and he'd return to train alone. Long after the gym had emptied, those who saw him said he looked haunted, as if the weight on the bar wasn't half as heavy as the one in his mind. Bodybuilding is a culture of extremes. And when the body breaks, the mind often turns to other extremes to fill the void. For Paul, that void grew unbearable. Painkillers at first for injuries that never healed. Then stronger things. Substances that dulled the noise inside his head, that offered brief illusions of peace in exchange for everything else. The newspapers would later call it addiction. But what it really was surrender. He wasn't chasing a high. He was chasing silence. He tried to rebuild his life, rehab, odd jobs, trying to stay close to the gym scene without losing himself completely. But each attempt ended the same way. The weight of expectation crushed him again. His friends spoke of how kind he was, how he'd help anyone who asked, how he never played the arrogant star. But behind that quiet kindness, there was despair. He knew what he'd lost. He knew the body that had made him famous was now a burden too heavy to carry. The Prodigy who once conquered the NPC Nationals was now sleeping on couches, walking alone through neighborhoods that no longer recognized him. Paul's final years were a long descent, a man at war with himself. He'd built a body so powerful it demanded worship, but that body required endless maintenance, endless pain, endless sacrifice. He couldn't stop training even when he knew it was killing him. Because the moment he stopped, he wasn't Quadzilla anymore. He was just Paul, and Paul didn't know who that was. He once told a training partner, "I don't know how to live without this. I only know how to chase it." That's the tragedy of all perfectionists. They mistake the chase for life itself. In the end, his strength, the same thing that lifted him out of obscurity, turned inward, devouring him piece by piece. The stronger he tried to be, the weaker he became. In 2005, Paul DeMayo's story ended abruptly. A life that had burned so intensely went out in quiet tragedy. Reports spoke of substance struggles, isolation, heartbreak. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The body he built to conquer the world had finally conquered him. When word of his death spread, the bodybuilding world reacted with shock, then silence. Photos of him resurfaced, the monstrous legs, the proud stance, the youthful fire in his eyes. And for a moment, everyone remembered why they had loved him, not because he was perfect, but because he believed in perfection, even when it broke him. There are no statues of Paul DeMayo, no streets named after him, no trophies in his name. But in every gym where a young man grips a barbell, trying to build something greater than himself, a small fragment of Paul's spirit lingers, because he embodied the curse and the glory of the Iron Creed, the belief that through suffering, a man can ascend beyond mortality. But Paul's story teaches the other side of that truth. The iron never lies. It gives, and it takes, and sometimes it takes everything. There's a strange stillness in every old gym after dark. The weights rest in silence, the mirrors reflect only ghosts, and somewhere in that quiet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The breathing, the pacing, the war cry of a man chasing something just beyond his reach. That's where Paul DeMayo still lives, not in magazines, not in records, but in that eternal echo of pursuit. He was a prodigy, yes, but more than that. He was a symbol, a mirror reflecting what happens when the human desire to transcend becomes too pure, too consuming, too absolute. In an age obsessed with strength, Paul's story reminds us that the greatest danger is not weakness, it's obsession untempered by peace. He achieved what millions dream of, a physique that made history. Yet the deeper he carved his body into perfection, the more he hollowed himself from within. The tragedy wasn't that he fell. The tragedy was that he could never stop climbing. When we look at the photos of Paul now, the quads like marble, the gaze fierce but tired, we're not just looking at a bodybuilder. We're looking at the cost of transcendence. Every inch of that muscle was paid for in solitude, pain, and years of silent sacrifice. He wasn't a saint or a victim. He was something rarer, a man who gave his entire being to a single ideal. And though that ideal consumed him, it also immortalized him. In that sense, Paul DeMayo became what he always sought to be, timeless. A name that endures not just in bodybuilding, but in the mythology of men who dared to go too far in the name of greatness. Because the truth is this, every man who lifts seeks a form of redemption. From weakness, from doubt, from the chaos of a world that doesn't care, the gym becomes a temple, the barbell a confession, the pain a kind of prayer. But the lesson of Paul's life, the one carved into every rep of his story, is that strength without balance becomes destruction. The same fire that forges steel can also melt it. He was, in the end, not destroyed by drugs or fame or injury. He was destroyed by his own devotion, and yet, in a strange, painful way, that's what makes him eternal. Because while most men live quietly and fade without purpose, Paul burned like a star, brilliant, brief, unforgettable. When you walk into a gym tonight and hear the iron clatter, remember him. Remember that the weight in your hands can build you, but it can also bury you. Remember that discipline is sacred, but peace is divine. And when you leave, under the hum of the lights and the smell of metal and chalk, let this echo in your chest. The iron never lies. It will test your body. It will reveal your soul. And if you let it, it will show you the cost of perfection.